We interrupt regular programming with breaking news out of Texas. A woman has been found murdered inside her own home. Police confirm 43-year-old Janice Hartman was discovered dead early this morning in her bedroom. Investigators say there were no signs of forced entry, no break-in, no intruder. Authorities are calling this a domestic homicide and say the killer may have been someone already inside the house.
It happened inside the place she should have been safest. In the early hours of a Texas morning in 1995, Janice Hartman was found dead in her own bedroom, her life violently taken behind closed doors, with no sign of forced entry, no screaming neighbors and no clear answers. There was no stranger lurking in the shadows outside, no broken window, no kicked-in door. This was a domestic homicide, quiet, personal, and devastating. Janice Hartman did not die in a dark alley or an abandoned field. She died at home, and nearly 3 decades later, no one has been held accountable. This is the story of what happened that night, and why the truth may still be buried inside the walls of the house she never walked out of alive. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet only found in suburban Texas after midnight. Most families were asleep. Porch lights glowed softly. Lawns lay undisturbed. Nothing about the house suggested violence, and yet inside a woman was dead. When police arrived, they found a scene that immediately unsettled them, not because it was chaotic, but because it wasn't. There were no overturned tables, no shattered glass, no obvious struggle stretching from room to room. The violence had been contained, deliberate and terrifyingly close. Janice Hartman's death did not look like a burglary gone wrong. It looked like something far more personal. Janice was discovered by someone who knew her, someone who had shared that home, that life, that routine. The call to authorities came from inside the house. The voice on the other end of the line did not report an intruder. It did not describe a break-in. It described a wife, unresponsive, not breathing. By the time emergency responders arrived, it was already too late. Janice Hartman was pronounced dead at the scene, and almost immediately, investigators were confronted with a chilling realization. Whoever killed her had likely been inside the house with her, willingly let in or never left at all. To understand the crime, investigators first had to understand the victim. Janice Hartman was not a drifter. She was not involved in crime. She was not living a secret double life, at least not one that ever surfaced. She was a wife, a homemaker, a woman living an ordinary Texas life. Friends and acquaintances described her as quiet, dependable, routine-oriented, the kind of person who followed patterns, grocery shopping on certain days, familiar neighbors, familiar routes. Nothing about Janice suggested she was expecting danger, and that made her death even harder to explain. Outwardly, Janice's marriage appeared stable. There were no public records of domestic violence, no dramatic police calls, no restraining orders. But investigators know something the rest of us often forget. Most domestic homicides do not erupt from visible chaos. They grow quietly, behind closed doors masked by routine. Arguments don't have witnesses. Tensions don't leave bruises. Fear doesn't always call the police. And in 1995, conversations about emotional abuse, coercion, or control were rarely documented, even when they existed. The autopsy would confirm what detectives already feared. Janice Hartman did not die of natural causes. Her death was ruled a homicide. The injuries told a story not of random violence, but of close-range, controlled aggression. This was not a panicked attack. This was not a stranger acting on impulse. It was intimate. It was deliberate. And it raised the most dangerous question in any domestic homicide case. If there was no forced entry and no sign of an intruder, who else was inside that house. Investigators did what protocol demanded. They started with the person closest to Janice, her husband. This did not mean guilt. It meant proximity. In cases like this, the truth often hides in timelines. Who was awake, who was asleep, who heard what and when. Statements were taken. Details were repeated. Small inconsistencies were noted, not as proof but as threads to be followed. And yet, from the beginning, this case refused to cooperate. There was no confession, no eyewitness, no physical evidence that clearly pointed in one direction, only silence. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The house was cleaned, the neighborhood moved on, but the case didn't. Evidence existed, but not enough. Suspicions existed, but not certainty. And slowly, quietly, the murder of Janice Hartman began to slip into the category investigators dread the most: unsolved. No arrest, no trial, no justice. What happened inside that bedroom has never been fully explained. Was it a crime of rage? A moment years in the making? Or something investigators missed in the earliest hours? Janice Hartman's voice was silenced, but the questions she left behind never were. And in the next part of this story, we go backward into the years before the murder to examine the marriage, the dynamics, and the warning signs that may have been hiding in plain sight. Because the truth about Janice Hartman's death may not begin with how she died, but with how she lived. To understand how Janice Hartman died, investigators knew they had to rewind time, not to the night of the murder, but to the years before it. Because most domestic homicides are not sudden explosions of violence. They are endings. Endings to patterns. Endings to routines. Endings to tensions that build quietly until one night they cross a line that cannot be uncrossed. And Janice Hartman lived inside a routine that on the surface looked perfectly normal. Janice was not someone who drew attention. She kept a schedule. She kept a home. She kept things running. Neighbors remembered her as polite, reserved, the kind of woman who waved but didn't linger. Someone you might exchange pleasantries with but never truly know. She did the grocery shopping. She managed the house. She lived inside the quiet expectations placed on many women of her generation. And like many women in the early 1990s, she was expected to endure more than she spoke about. Marriage in the 1990s carried different rules. Problems stayed inside the home. Arguments were private, and endurance was often mistaken for strength. Friends did not recall dramatic fights. There were no public scenes. No police called to the house in moments of rage. But the absence of noise does not mean the absence of conflict. Investigators later noted that the quietest homes often conceal the deepest fractures. There are forms of domestic strain that leave no marks. Control, isolation, emotional withdrawal. In 1995, these were not things people documented. They were endured. Janice did not file complaints. She did not confide deeply in friends. If there were problems, they remained invisible, at least on paper, and that invisibility would later haunt investigators. Because when violence finally surfaced, there was no documented trail leading up to it. Routine can be comforting, but it can also be camouflage. Janice followed patterns, predictable days, predictable movements. To an outsider, it looked like stability. To investigators looking back, it looked like isolation, a life that rarely intersected with people who might notice change. No coworkers to confide in, no daily social environment where concerns could surface, just a home, a marriage, and silence. Investigators later interviewed anyone who might have noticed something, anything. a change in mood, a comment made in passing, a moment of unease. What they found were fragments, a neighbor recalling tension but nothing specific, an acquaintance remembering Janice seemed withdrawn, a sense that something wasn't right, but never enough to justify intervention. Domestic violence does not always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits. In the days leading up to her death, nothing outwardly changed. No frantic calls. No sudden departures. No visible escalation. Janice went about her life as she always had, and that made the murder even harder to understand. Because when violence comes without warning, it forces investigators to ask an uncomfortable question. Was the warning there all along, simply unseen? As detectives reconstructed Janice Hartman's life, a pattern began to emerge, not of obvious abuse, but of emotional isolation. And that pattern raised a troubling possibility. If the tension existed only inside the home, if no one else ever witnessed it, then the truth about what happened might be known by only two people. One of them was dead, and the other was still talking. Silence can protect secrets. It can also protect perpetrators. In cases like Janice Hartman's, investigators often face a wall, not of lies, but of missing context. No history to prove motive. No witnesses to confirm escalation. No documented trail leading to that final night. Just a marriage, a home, and a woman who never left it alive. In the next part of this story, we return to the investigation itself, the timelines, the statements, and the inconsistencies that would quietly shape this case into one of Texas's most haunting unsolved domestic homicides. The final hours of Janice Hartman's life were unremarkable, at least on the surface. No reported arguments. No raised voices heard by neighbors. No calls placed to friends or family. Investigators would later reconstruct the evening minute by minute, searching for a moment when normalcy cracked. But the timeline resisted clarity. What time did Janice go to bed? Who was awake? And who was asleep? What sounds were heard and which ones were missed? In cases like this, every minute matters, especially the minutes no one remembers clearly. The emergency call came from inside the house. The voice on the line reported a wife, unresponsive, not breathing. There was urgency, but not panic. Dispatchers are trained to listen not just to words, but to tone, to breathing, hesitation, emotional spikes. Nothing about the call immediately screamed deception, but nothing about it erased doubt either. Because when responders arrived, the scene they encountered raised questions the call did not answer. Paramedics moved quickly. They followed protocol. They attempted resuscitation. They confirmed what the caller already feared. Janice Hartman was dead. But it didn't take long for responders to sense something was wrong. This did not feel like a medical emergency gone bad. This felt like a crime scene. The bedroom spoke, quietly but clearly. There were signs of disturbance, but not a violent struggle that spilled across the house. No drawers pulled open, no valuables missing, no reason to believe an intruder had searched for anything. The violence had been focused, contained, close, and that narrowed the scope of the investigation almost immediately. Detectives checked the doors, the windows, the garage. Nothing. No broken locks, no pry marks, no shattered glass. Whoever killed Janice Hartman did not force their way inside. They were either invited in or already there. In domestic homicide investigations, this detail changes everything. Investigators began asking questions. Gently at first, they asked about the evening, the routine. The last conversation. The answers were calm, measured, consistent. At least initially, there was no immediate contradiction, no obvious lie. But detectives know something most people don't. Truth rarely arrives all at once. It leaks out through small inconsistencies, forgotten details, timelines that shift just slightly with repetition. And as the hours passed, subtle gaps began to appear. The timeline was the first thing to crack. Certain times didn't align perfectly. Certain actions lacked confirmation. Certain moments existed only in memory, and memory is fragile under stress. Investigators weren't accusing, they were probing. Because when two people are the only witnesses to a moment and one of them is dead, the truth becomes dangerously dependent on the other. Forensics in 1995 were not what they are today. DNA testing existed, but it was slow, expensive, and limited. What investigators found was underwhelming. No clear foreign DNA, no weapon definitively tied to a suspect, no physical evidence that told a complete story. The absence of evidence didn't mean innocence. It meant uncertainty, and uncertainty is the enemy of prosecution. As days passed, the urgency faded. Witness memories cooled. Evidence remained inconclusive, and without a confession or forensic breakthrough, the case stalled. No arrest was made. No charges were filed. The death of Janice Hartman quietly shifted from an active investigation to something far more dangerous, a case waiting for something new. Life continued, at least on the outside. The house remained standing. The neighborhood stayed quiet, but the questions never left. Because even without proof, investigators felt it. Something about that night didn't sit right. And in the next part of this story, we examine what happens when a case goes cold, how missed opportunities, limitations of the era, and human hesitation can allow a killer to walk free. Every investigation has a moment where urgency fades. For Janice Hartman's case, that moment arrived quietly. The initial surge of activity slowed. Interviews stopped producing new information. Evidence failed to evolve into proof. Detectives didn't stop caring, but without something concrete, the case began to drift. And drifting is how cases die. In 1995, forensic science was both promising and limited. DNA testing existed, but only in specific forms. Touch DNA analysis had not yet emerged. Small trace evidence often went untested due to cost and uncertainty. If evidence didn't clearly point somewhere, it often stayed on a shelf. And in Janice Hartman's case, the evidence whispered. It never shouted. Evidence was logged. Photographs were taken. Reports were written. But evidence without direction is powerless. Without a suspect they could legally charge, prosecutors had no case to build. And without new evidence, detectives had nowhere to go. The murder remained officially unsolved. Prosecutors don't pursue what they suspect. They pursue what they can prove. In Janice Hartman's case, suspicion existed, but suspicion is not evidence. No jury would convict on feelings. No judge would allow a case built on implication alone. Bringing charges without certainty would risk acquittal, and once acquitted, a suspect can never be tried again. So the decision was made not to move forward. Without charges, there was no trial. Without a trial, there was no truth publicly examined. Janice Hartman became another name in a file cabinet. Another victim without justice. Her death was acknowledged. Her case was recorded, but her story stopped being told. Cold cases are not abandoned all at once. They are set aside, first for a day, then a week, then indefinitely. New crimes demand attention. Fresh victims require resources, and slowly the unanswered questions surrounding Janice Hartman's death were pushed into the background. The house did not remain a crime scene forever. It was cleaned, occupied, returned to normal life, but walls remember what people try to forget. And for those who knew the truth was incomplete, the silence grew louder with time. Time does not heal cold cases. It erodes them. Memories fade, witnesses move away or die. Evidence degrades. Each passing year makes answers harder to reach. And with every year that passed, Janice Hartman's case slipped further into the shadows. Cold cases carry a particular weight, not just the loss, but the possibility that something was missed. A question not asked, a detail dismissed, a moment where hesitation changed everything. And in the next part of this story, we confront the most difficult section of all: the unanswered questions, the theories investigators quietly considered, and the truth that may still be waiting to surface. When a case goes cold, it doesn't disappear. It waits. Janice Hartman's file remained intact, sealed, cataloged, untouched for years at a time. Occasionally revisited, then set back down again. Not because investigators stopped caring, but because nothing new had surfaced. And yet, unanswered questions have a way of refusing silence. At the center of the case was one unavoidable question. How does a woman die violently in her own home without anyone else hearing, seeing, or interrupting it? There was no forced entry, no evidence of a stranger, no sign of an attempted escape. The crime appeared contained, controlled, and private. And that reality forced investigators to consider possibilities they could never publicly prove. Theory 1. A domestic escalation. This theory suggests the violence erupted suddenly, possibly after years of unspoken tension. Not a planned murder, not a long-standing conspiracy, but a moment where control snapped, where an argument turned fatal behind closed doors. Domestic homicides often follow this pattern, but theory alone cannot stand in court. Without witnesses, injuries pointing to escalation, or a confession, this theory remained just that, a possibility, not proof. Theory 2. A crime of opportunity. Investigators briefly considered whether someone known to Janice, not living in the home, could have been invited inside, a trusted acquaintance, a familiar presence. But this theory struggled under scrutiny. There was no evidence of theft, no sign of departure, no trace left behind, and no confirmed reason anyone else would have been there. Theory 3. Something critical was missed. A detail overlooked in the first hours, a piece of evidence not tested, a statement not fully challenged. This theory haunts investigators the most because if the truth was there from the beginning and simply went unnoticed, then time itself became the accomplice. None of these theories reached the standard required for prosecution. Suspicion is not evidence. Patterns are not proof. Feelings are not facts. And without something tangible, a confession, DNA, a credible witness, the case could not move forward. The justice system demands certainty. Janice Hartman's case had none. Unsolved cases don't just haunt investigators, they haunt families, communities. Anyone who knows the truth was never spoken aloud. Janice Hartman did not receive justice. Her death did not receive answers. And that absence leaves a wound that never fully heals. Today, the tools are different. DNA testing has evolved. Cold cases are reopened with fresh eyes. Old evidence can speak in ways it once couldn't. If something still exists, preserved intact, the truth may yet surface. But it requires willingness to look again, to question again, to reopen wounds long left untouched. Janice Hartman's murder remains officially unsolved, but unresolved does not mean forgotten. Somewhere in the silence, in a memory, a detail, a piece of evidence, the answer still exists. And in the final part of this story, we confront the legacy of this case and why telling it now still matters. Some cases close, others simply stop. Janice Hartman's murder was never solved, not because no one cared, but because certainty never arrived. No confession, no arrest, no courtroom where her story could be spoken aloud, just a file waiting. Investigators carry unsolved cases differently. They don't forget the names, they don't forget the faces, they remember the feeling, the sense that something was left unfinished. Janice Hartman became one of those cases, a reminder that sometimes the truth is close, but never close enough. Domestic homicide is one of the most difficult crimes to solve. It happens in private. It leaves few witnesses, and it often follows years of tension that never reaches official records. Janice Hartman's death reflects a truth society still struggles to confront. Not all danger announces itself. Justice requires answers. It requires facts that can withstand scrutiny, and in this case, the justice system was left with questions instead. Janice Hartman never received a verdict, never received accountability, never received closure. Cold cases are not dead cases. They are waiting cases, waiting for technology to catch up, waiting for someone to speak, waiting for courage or guilt to finally break the silence. As long as evidence exists, as long as memory exists, justice remains possible. Janice Hartman was more than a case number. She was a woman with routines, with relationships, with a life that mattered. Her death should not be remembered only as an unsolved mystery, but as a reminder of the lives behind the headlines. Truth has a memory. It lingers in places, in moments, in people who were there and never spoke. And sometimes the truth waits patiently until someone is finally ready to hear it. Who killed Janice Hartman? It is a question that has never been answered, but asking it still matters, because silence protects no one, and forgetting only ensures it happens again. In 1995, Janice Hartman died in her own home. The world moved on, but the truth did not disappear. It remains waiting in the quiet for justice to finally catch up. If you want more gripping true crime stories like this, hit like and subscribe and never miss a case.